When Japan launched its war across the Pacific, its pilots climbed into the cockpit of the most feared carrier fighter in the world and expected easy kills. The F4F Wildcat looked like prey. Slow, stubby, outclassed on paper by almost every measure. But somewhere between the first dogfight and the grinding campaigns of Guadalcanal, Japanese assessments started changing. What they concluded privately would surprise you. December 1941. The bombs are still falling on Pearl Harbor when U.S. Navy pilots scramble to meet Japan's first wave, and the aircraft they're climbing into is the Grumman F4F Wildcat. It isn't glamorous, it isn't fast. With a top speed of around 318 miles per hour, it's already being outpaced by newer designs on the drawing board. Its landing gear has to be hand cranked up by the pilot, 29 full rotations of a hand crank just to get the wheels up after takeoff. Compared to what Japan was flying, it looked like America showed up to a gunfight with a kitchen knife. But the Wildcat was what the Navy had, and it had to be enough. Grumman built it tough, almost obsessively so. The fuselage was a dense metal cage around the pilot. The self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb punishment that would send other aircraft down in flames. 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns gave it devastating firepower at close range. It wasn't built to dance in the sky. It was built to take a punch, deliver one, back, and keep flying. The pilots who flew it were equally aware of its weaknesses. Veterans from the early Pacific campaigns described the sinking feeling of watching a Zero accelerate away from them in a climb, effortlessly pulling out of reach. The Wildcat couldn't follow. Trying to turn with a Zero in a low-speed maneuvering fight was practically a death sentence. Every experienced Wildcat pilot knew that. The ones who forgot it usually didn't come back. And yet, kill ratios from the early campaigns tell a more complicated story. At Guadalcanal alone, Wildcat pilots racked up exchange ratios that stunned analysts on both sides of the Pacific. The question is why? And the answer starts not in Washington, but in Tokyo, where Japanese commanders were already quietly asking the same question. If this kind of history hits different for you, subscribe to Vintage Planes. There's a lot more where this came from. To understand Japan's shock, you first have to understand their confidence, and that confidence had a name, the Mitsubishi A6M0. When it entered service in 1940, it was genuinely unlike anything the world had seen on a carrier deck. A top speed of 331 miles per hour, a range of over 1,600 miles, almost double what most Allied fighters could manage. It could outturn, outclimb, and outrun virtually every opponent it met in the opening months of the war. In China, Zero pilots were racking up kill ratios of 12-1, 12-1. Japan's Naval Air Force built its entire Pacific strategy around that aircraft and the elite pilots flying it. These weren't average airmen. Japan's carrier pilots in 1941 represented years of rigorous selection and brutal training. Many had hundreds of hours of combat experience from the China campaigns. They were, by almost any measure, the finest naval aviators in the world at that moment. And they knew it. When briefings before Pearl Harbor described the aircraft they'd be facing, including the Wildcat, there was no alarm in the room. The Zero's performance data made the matchup look straightforward. Japanese commanders calculated the Wildcat would be neutralized quickly, leaving American carriers exposed. The strategic logic was clean. Destroy the fighters, sink the carriers, dominate the Pacific. The Wildcat barely registered as a serious threat in Japanese operational planning. That certainty would prove costly. Because Japanese confidence in the Zero created a blind spot, one that military planners rarely admit to until after the losses start mounting. The Zero was built almost entirely for offense. Legendary maneuverability came at a price: no armor plating behind the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, a fuel system that could turn the aircraft into a fireball from a single well-placed burst. Japan traded survivability for performance, and in the opening months that trade looked genius. But the Wildcat was specifically the kind of opponent that exposed that gamble, and it took Japan far longer than it should have to admit it. What happened in the first real clashes between these two aircraft will completely reframe how you think about underdog stories in military history. Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal. These aren't just famous battles, they're the laboratories where the Wildcat's reputation was built and Japan's assumptions were stress-tested against reality. And the results were not what Tokyo expected. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Wildcat pilots flying combat air patrol over the American carriers faced overwhelming numbers of Zeros and Val dive bombers. By raw performance metrics, they should have been swept aside. Instead, they tangled, absorbed punishment, and kept Japanese attackers busy long enough for the battle's outcome to hinge on dive bombers, finding Japan's carriers with their decks packed with refueling aircraft. A catastrophic vulnerability that had nothing to do with the Wildcat at all. But the fighter's stubborn presence in the air mattered. It was Guadalcanal, however, that truly recalibrated everything. From August 1942 onward, Wildcat pilots flying from Henderson Field engaged Japanese aircraft in daily combat over the island and the surrounding waters. The conditions were brutal: heat, fatigue, mechanical stress, and constant attrition. But something remarkable emerged from that grinding campaign. American pilots, led by figures like Joe Foss and John Smith, were not just surviving against the Zero, they were winning. The key was a tactic developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, now known as the Thatch Weave. Two Wildcats flying in a loose formation would cross paths when one was attacked, forcing the pursuing Zero into the gun sight of the other. It neutralized the Zero's maneuverability advantage by turning it into a liability. Instead of one Wildcat trying to outturn a Zero, two Wildcats were working as a coordinated system. Japanese pilots, trained for individual excellence in a maneuvering fight, had no clean answer for it. After-action reports from Japanese squadrons began noting something unsettling. American pilots weren't fighting like they were supposed to. They weren't taking the bait of a turning fight. They were diving, firing, and extending, hit and run, energy tactics. It was disciplined, cold, and effective, and it was costing Japan pilots an aircraft it couldn't easily replace. What Japanese intelligence analysts actually wrote in their classified reports about the Wildcat and the pilots flying it is the part of this story almost nobody talks about. Stick with vintage planes, subscribe, and never miss a deep dive like this one. Here is where the story shifts from the battlefield to the briefing room and gets genuinely fascinating. As losses mounted through 1942 and into 1943, Japan's Naval Air Force conducted formal assessments of the aircraft and tactics they were facing. Some of these documents survived the war. What they reveal is a portrait of institutional discomfort, the language of organizations being forced to admit something they'd rather not. Japanese after-action analyses consistently flagged the Wildcat's structural durability as a serious tactical problem. Pilots reported hitting Wildcats with burst after burst and watching them keep flying. One recurring observation in Japanese pilot debriefs was the frustration of sending an aircraft down smoking, only to see it recover and return to base. The self-sealing tanks and armor plating that added weight and cost the Wildcat performance were, in combat, saving American lives and denying Japan clean kill confirmations. Japan had optimized the Zero for a kind of war where aircraft that were hit went down. The Wildcat refused to follow that script. Beyond the aircraft itself, Japanese intelligence reporting increasingly focused on the pilots, and the tone in those documents is telling. Early assessments had dismissed American aviators as less disciplined and less skilled than their Japanese counterparts. By mid-1942, that assessment was being quietly revised. Reports from Guadalcanal noted that American pilots were exhibiting tactical patience and coordination at a level that contradicted the earlier dismissals. The Thatch Weave appeared in Japanese intelligence summaries by name, analyzed and taken seriously as a genuine tactical innovation, not a lucky improvisation. Perhaps most revealing was the internal discussion around Japan's own aircraft development. The Zero's lack of protection which had never been a serious concern before the Pacific War, became an urgent engineering problem precisely because of what Wildcat engagements had demonstrated. Japan attempted upgrades and eventually developed successor aircraft partly in response to lessons learned fighting the Wildcat. The aircraft they'd dismissed had forced a redesign conversation at the highest levels of Japanese aviation. None of this was ever announced publicly in Japan. The cultural and institutional pressure to project confidence was immense, but in the classified reports, the picture that emerges is one of genuine, growing respect, delivered in the clipped, reluctant language of analysts who don't enjoy being wrong. The final chapter of this story, how Japan's view of the Wildcat shifted by the war's end, lands harder than you'd expect. By 1943, the F4F Wildcat was being pulled from frontline carrier duty. The F6F Hellcat had arrived, faster, more powerful, purpose-built to dominate the Zero, and the Wildcat stepped aside. On paper, that looked like the end of its story. In reality, the Wildcat's most lasting impact wasn't in what it destroyed. It was in what it forced Japan to confront. Japanese veterans who spoke openly after the war kept returning to the same uncomfortable truth. The Wildcat had earned respect nobody in Tokyo had budgeted for. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most celebrated surviving ace and a man who chose his words carefully, was direct in post-war interviews. He spoke about the quality of American pilots he encountered, their discipline, their refusal to be drawn into the kind of individual maneuvering duel the Zero was built to win. He talked about American aircraft absorbing punishment that would have destroyed a Zero outright. The Wildcat wasn't supposed to be able to do that. It did it anyway. That durability wasn't an accident, it was a philosophy. America designed the Wildcat around the mission: get the pilot home, protect the fuel, absorb the hit, and keep fighting. Japan designed the Zero around the pilot, give him every performance advantage possible, and trust his skill to do the rest. Both approaches made sense, but they were suited to very different kinds of wars. Japan planned for a fast, decisive campaign where superior performance would shatter American resistance before attrition became a factor. The war that actually unfolded was the opposite: grinding, industrial, months turning into years. In that war, an aircraft you could repair, fuel safely, and fly again tomorrow was worth more than one that could outturn anything in the sky before getting shot down over open ocean. Japan's classified assessments from 1942 and 1943 reflect the slow, painful recognition of that miscalculation. The Wildcat's toughness wasn't a flaw they could dismiss. It was a strategic variable they hadn't accounted for, and by the time they fully understood it, the Hellcat had arrived to make the point even harder to argue with. The Wildcat never won a beauty contest. It won something more useful: time, pilots, and battles that shouldn't have been survivable. That's a legacy no performance chart fully captures. Japan went into the Pacific War expecting the Wildcat to be a footnote. Instead, it became the aircraft that forced Japan to rethink its pilots, its tactics, and its planes. From classified intelligence reports to veteran testimonies, the picture is the same: grudging, private, genuine respect. The Wildcat didn't beat the Zero by being better. It beat it by refusing to lose. Keep exploring stories like this one with vintage planes. History hits different when you know what really happened.